Hello, everybody. Welcome to Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. I'm Nick Malavita. I will be your moderator for today's show. And today's show, we're going to discuss the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts of 2017, otherwise known as the Trump tax cuts. Did they really benefit Americans? And just my quick analysis before we bring David Walker in and a huge panel to discuss this. At least from the reading I got, it did benefit Americans if you're in the top 1%. Your taxes went down about $60,000. If you're middle class, you dropped about $900. And if you're lower class, you saved $70. So it benefited the 1% tremendously. And what did it do for the deficit? It increased the deficit $4 trillion. So what we did is we borrowed huge amounts of money to take care of the top 1%. They really need the tax benefits. But that's just my quick analysis. We have a whole panel plus the Honorable David Walker. And the reason I'm saying it now is I know we'll get a word in edgewise between now and the end of the program. So we'll bring in the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States. It looks to me that this Tax Cut Act was a complete waste of $4 trillion, helping the 1% so Elon Musk and his friends could get richer. So David, I don't know what your thoughts are, but at least from my reading, this is a big scam on the American public, and people are buying it.
My first thoughts are roll tide. The second thing is that, look, I think it's important that when we talk about these things, we put things in context. I assume the $4 trillion that you're talking about is over a 10-year period, because there's no way it could be a one-year number. And the tax cuts don't last 10 years, for one thing. They're set to expire at the end of 2025. My best bet is some of them will be extended, but not all of them will be extended based upon where things stand right now. I will say several things at the outset, and I'm looking forward to our panelists. First, not all tax cuts stimulate the economy, and very, very few tax cuts pay for themselves. These clearly did not. A lot of times politicians want to argue, well, we ended up having more nominal revenues after the tax cuts than before. But the proper metric is revenues as a percentage of GDP. Because by definition, when you have inflation, you're going to get more revenues. In addition to that, you have bracket creep. People get into higher tax brackets merely, over time because of increase in wages. I think that you also have to break it down between corporate taxation and individual taxation. On the corporate side, clearly a lot of the reforms made us more competitive on an international basis. My personal view is the tax rate went down lower than it needed to. When I did the 2012 National Fiscal Responsibility Bus Tour, there was overwhelming support to bring the corporate tax rate down to 25%, which would make us very competitive. Trump took it down to 21%. With regard to the individual side, yes, the wealthy benefited more because they're the ones that pay a vast majority of the taxes. You really have to look at percentages. You really can't look at gross dollars. And what a lot of people forget is that millions of people were taken off the tax rolls because of the significant increase in the standard deduction. It went up dramatically as part of that act, and there were certain things that were in it that helped people who had children, such as the refundable child care tax credit, which I think will be extended and potentially even increased, depending upon what happens in the election. We have to keep in mind that over 40% of individuals who file tax returns pay zero income tax. And in addition to that, about 20% of people who end up filing individual income tax returns not only pay zero income tax, they get money back because of refundable tax credits, the earned income tax credit, the child care tax credit. So the bottom line is we need comprehensive tax reform that makes it simpler, fairer, more competitive, and generates more revenues as a percentage of GDP. And we have to look at it differently with regard to corporate versus individual, because on the corporate situation, we have to stay competitive globally. The other thing that a lot of people mix up is, most small businesses are not C corporations. Most of them are either partnerships or S corporations, and they get taxed at individual tax rates. They don't get taxed at corporate tax rates. And there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there, you know. But bottom line, we need another round of tax reform. These cuts did not pay for themselves. Some of them will be extended. Some of them should not be extended. But frankly, we need a much more comprehensive reform if we want to be able to restore fiscal sanity, maintain our competitive posture, improve equity, and improve enforceability, because the current tax law is way, way, way too complicated.
Okay, that sounds like a good opening statement. We're going to bring in some of our panelists. First of all, David Kinder, who's actually has his own podcast, Financial Advocacy Podcast. Bill Danko, who is part of the famous Millionaire Next Door. And of course, we'll listen to what he has to say. John Power, who's a certified tax coach. So he does this professionally. And Dr. Dan Worthington, who is a former dean of the University of South Dakota School of Law. You heard the opening statements by myself and David Walker. So I'll start with you, David Kinder. What are your thoughts about these tax cuts? They just benefit the top 1% and create a $4 trillion hole. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, I'm not an economist, but I did write about this when it was first passed and such, and I pretty much stole all my notes from CNN Money. And here's the thing also is that Trump also did a lot of, he enforced the $10,000 state tax, income tax deduction limit, which, what does that do to property owners? Essentially the blue high income, high property value states. It limited your deduction against your federal taxes. And by the way, here's something that I find strange is that Biden had promised, I think he campaigned, that he was going to rescind that. Hasn't done it yet. I find that interesting. And since I am here in a blue state, I find that interesting. So that's the first part. Of course, the standard deduction essentially doubled. The personal exemption is gone. There's a lot of things. By the way, I find it interesting that Trump allowed that alimony payments will not be tax deductible. I find that hilarious.
Yeah.
So there were some things, but they were so minor. But at the same time, it hit the blue states a little bit harder. And I'm not talking about the 1%. I'm talking about basically anybody that owns property in California, especially if you're in the higher earner parts of the state, you got hit harder, especially from your property tax standpoint. So that's the main things. Whether it had the ripple effect, I think there was far more of an emotional component to it. I think it was more of a wash of everything when we take it all down.
Okay, we're going to bring in David Walker, who, we're going to bring in Bill Danko. Sorry about that, Bill, who's author of The Millionaire Next Door and Richer Than a Millionaire. I'm wondering if this has helped out the millionaire class in terms of these Trump tax cuts. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, Nick, you started with a very provocative position, and I like what David Walker had to say. You got to look at it as a percent. You know, I have looked at a June 2024 Cato report, and if you look at the percentages, you can see that the lower income people did benefit the most percentage-wise based on their analysis, and the affluent and the very high end had the less percentage rate. And of course, this makes sense because, well, if you make more money, you're going to get a bigger cut, even though the top 1% got 0.04% savings from the tax cut compared to 2017 to 2018. So, you know, in absolute numbers, yeah, the rich made out well, but in percentage wise, it was a very modest effect. So, okay.
That's fair enough. And now we'll bring in John Power, because he actually has to deal with this. He's on the front lines, certified tax coach, and does tax returns for a living. So we haven't seen John for a while, but now we're going to jump into the TCJA of 2017. Did it help your clients, your poor clients, or what happened here?
Okay, thanks, Nick. I agree with much of what David said. We certainly did need to reduce corporate tax rates to be competitive internationally. most of the lobbying before that bill was passed by the large companies, the Chamber of Commerce, things like that, were asking for a 25% tax rate. So why it ended up being even lower, I don't know. Trump has proposed, and then if elected in the next administration, it would lower it to 17%. I don't think that would happen. I think it would be a terrible idea. So I think that was important. Along with that, there was significant changes for individuals also. For example, as David said, most businesses are pass-through entities. The addition of not only some lowering of the tax brackets, but the new qualified business income deduction, 199 Cap A, is a significant deduction and reduces the effective tax rates considerably. That is also part of the reason why they didn't pay for themselves. The part of the problem though with the TCJA is things that have happened subsequent to that. There was a significant reduction on the business interest deduction. So a company that has heavily can very possibly lose all of their deduction for interest expense. I had a client that they actually lost money, but showed taxable income because they couldn't deduct their interest expense. That phased in later on in that 10-year TCJA period. Another item that's been very detrimental is a change in the R&D credits that everybody they put in there as part of the pay for. Everybody knew that they were going to change it, and because Congress can't agree that today's Monday, they didn't, and so that for businesses that have research activities, and can be a fairly broad category. That change was very significant, as they had now capitalized research expenditures, amortized them over basically a six-year period. And again, you see companies now facing substantial taxable income when they're not, from an economic perspective, maybe not making any money. So there was some good positive changes, I think, to begin with, but in many cases the offsets that have come in now as we're coming into that, again, part of the pay for have been very detrimental.
Okay, we'll bring in Dr. Dan Worthington, who is a former dean of the South Dakota School of Law, and he has expertise in this area. What do you think about the tax cuts in 2017?
As far as the marginal rates were concerned for individual taxpayers, there wasn't much of a decrease. 39.6 was the highest rate. 37 became the highest rate. There was also a 3.8% tax on investment income for those making $250,000 or more. We sort of made up for that because that would include the investment class folks who are drawing down dividends and other things. So they actually got kind of give me and take me away kind of approach, along with the loss of the property tax deduction on the itemized deduction, which was very painful for people who owned high value properties and were deducting the taxes and that kind of thing. So, overall, okay, so the very, very uber wealthy, they hire lawyers and figure out ways to avoid tax legally anyway. So it didn't really have much of an impact for them. But it did affect the middle rich, right? Because the folks that do maybe have an accountant or someone else working for them, they strategize and do these other things and are expecting the tax code to be a particular way. And like John said, they get hurt because they lose their interest their business interest deduction, other kinds of things that affect them in a large way. So overall, now with respect to the corporate tax, As everyone knows, corporations are taxed at two levels, both at the corporate level and in the individual level on distributions. And so the net result of both of those was the 35% tax, because 20% corporate tax and 15% tax on dividends. And so it was sort of hypocritical to begin with that the tax was so high, and it made us non-competitive. The lowest tax rate, I think, corporately is what, 15% in Ireland. But the United States became far more competitive when the interest rate was lowered, and the combination of that and deregulation created in the created more of an environment pro business and pro productivity, which increased the size of the pie. So you know, so this idea of difference between equity and equality, and the question of who gets what and when, and how the pie is divided, we're all better off with a bigger pie. And as David said, if we're going to go to a formula that pegs federal spending to the gross national product, it's better to have increased production. In light of that, we've got a lot more demand on housing in the United States as a result of the illegal border crossings. A lot more demand on essentials, which puts price pressure for everyone else. The taxpayers, American people, regular folks, are paying for all that because they pay. Inflation is an indirect tax on the American people. Inflation has been horrible. It's been in some cases devastating to some families who can barely afford to make it. I'm talking about American citizens who are here legally and should be protected by our government, which are not being protected by our government. Overall, the Trump tax cuts, I'm sort of neutral on them. Really, I don't think it had impact everyone's claiming for the wretch that wouldn't have got it otherwise. And I think those who try to make that argument are being naive about how the tax system and business really works.
Okay, we'll listen to Kim Calhoun, the president of the Pod TV network. What are your thoughts about the Trump's tax cuts?
Well, I've been doing a lot of research in this area because I hear a lot of people complaining that things are either better or worse for them. So this is just part of my presentation that I'm putting together from other people's research and listening to, hours and hours of conferences that are about this from other university researchers. But in this collected data, it just blew me away because everything that it was supposed to do, it didn't do. It actually cut more jobs than it created. It failed to produce the promised investment or wage increases for the vast majority of the United States workers. You can go to the BLS.gov, which is the Bureau of Labor Stats, and it will show you that in 2016, we had the least amount in history of job cuts, and that was just prior to this act. And then by 2020, January 2020, we had the worst tax cuts in history. And that was prior to COVID, so you cannot blame the job cuts on COVID. Now, in research of all of this, it caused a huge tax revenue deficit on our country. And to recover that, they started increasing the taxes on anyone that were generating less than $72,000 per year. And this made me very curious because when I was visiting the grocery store just recently, I heard a lot of people complaining that their taxes went up. And these are people who make, $40,000 or less a year. And they were shocked because they got surprised with a new increase in tax. And then I was talking with some of my friends recently in the middle class income brackets, and they were complaining about the same problem, that they just had this strange increase in tax this year that they weren't anticipating, owing taxes. And the research indicated to me that this increase came from having to increase taxes on the people who are making less than $72,000 per year in order to recover that tax deficit. Now, something else that people don't talk about, yeah, they gave 40% tax cut to the corporations, but they also gave a 40% tax cut to the individual incomes that were generating more than $400,000 per year. So what happened where it should have created more and better paying jobs for the middle class, the tax cut actually increased the salaries for the executives of the corporations and created more job cuts. So the TCJA, which was supposed to generate more and better paying jobs, actually cut the jobs for the middle class. So the people who are complaining today need to be really looking at the real problem. And David has been saying we need a tax reform for a long time, but I think that this is the tax reform we need. Now, this tax act will expire in 2025. I believe it'll expire if Trump is not president. But I think if he becomes president, it will become a partisan law again, which is what it was back then. Then I listened to a lot of conferences on this. This was a partisan law, and it caused more problems for the hard workers. I even watched a really interesting interview of someone very wealthy who even said that. He said that this benefited him 100%, and it was harder on the workers, and it did not benefit small businesses at all. And that's where we need to focus to improve our economy. And traveling around the world, one of the things I saw in improving the economy was when the government focused on the local businesses and helped them prosper more than the big corporations. This was also supposed to this was also supposed to improve onshoring profits that were held overseas, and it didn't. It caused a bigger problem than it helped, and it created a bigger gap, a larger gap in the GDP. It was supposed to narrow the gap, and it created and widened the gap, and it continues to do so. So I think that I'm glad that people are admitting that it was not good. I'm proud that we've got people that are coming on this show and being honest, as opposed to saying it was something good. I'm proud that we have a group of people that will say it wasn't good and we need to fix it. And I think that's our priority. And we need to tell people, if you're having problems and struggling, it's because of that act. And if you're doing good, it's actually because of that act. So
we're gonna bring in Rick Rosner, who's a member of the Mega Society. For those people who don't know what that is, that's if you're in the top one out of 1 million people in IQ test in the United States of America. I've known about the Mega Society and Rick for years, but a lot of people don't know what that is. But anyway, Rick, what are your thoughts about the Tax Act? This
is like a pop quiz I'm not prepared to take. I didn't like the way that I'm a liberal, so I absorb information that, what do you call it? Confirmation error. In my understanding, Trump's tax cuts for the middle class expired. They gradually go away in 2019, 2021, 23, and go away altogether in 25 unless you reelect him. The tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy were made permanent. So obviously, if that is true, I don't like that.
Okay, well, we have a wealthy person who may disagree with you. We're going to bring in Shaquille Latmer from Australia, though he doesn't have he doesn't have a problem in the game because he's offshore anyway, like I am. But what are your thoughts? I'm beaming in from Barcelona, Spain, by the way.
Well, the only real thing that affected me obviously was the imputation credits on dividends, but that was quite minor. I think that a lowering of taxes generally leads to growth. Some of the comments that have been made here criticising the act would make it sound as though that what the government should do is to increase taxes, and that would somehow lead to a boost in the overall size of the economy, which I just don't think that ever works. I will make a couple of points though. Even from a domestic level and from the perspective of the United States trying to make itself attractive in a globalized world. Donald Trump at the moment is talking about protective tariffs and a reduction in the tax rate for companies that are manufacturing inside the United States. Now that will have a short-term boost to the US economy, I would suggest. But there's a lot of other things that you have to factor into that. The problem with high tax rates for individuals is that what it does is it makes it easier for old money, for lack of a better description, to remain in the position it's in, and those aspirants and those startup companies and those sorts of individuals behind it who are growing their wealth end up having to pay a much larger share of their earnings in taxes instead of being able to reinvest it. And so those people will look at countries, as Dan said, like Ireland with a 12.5% tax rate. And certainly if you're an international person, you're going to look at places where you don't have a lot of regulatory and taxation hurdles to overcome. So I would suggest the United States continues to look at how to make itself attractive, not just within the United States, but also for the international community, because you'd really want to be attracting people. You're the biggest economy in the world. You arguably have more opportunities than most other places, and you want to be attracting those people that have good business ideas, that have capital behind them. And a reduction in the tax doesn't simplify the tax code. Your tax code still is enormously large. You're one of the only countries in the world that has a tax system which is as progressive as it is. It's inefficient. It doesn't do a very good job. It doesn't raise very much as a percentage of the GDP versus countries with lower headline rates. So I think if you take the politics out of it and actually just focus on what's going to be better for boosting the economy, creating a better environment that's more conducive to attracting entrepreneurs and to encouraging startup companies to exist, I think that would dramatically help the United States, and in turn would help other countries that are natural allies of yours, such as Australia, such as the UK, both of which I'm a citizen of, Canada, obviously, and others. At the moment, a lot of people like myself would consider starting a business in Canada and relying on the free trade agreement between you guys, rather than starting the business in the United States, in order to not have to go through all the regulations and tax hurdles that I've got as a non-citizen in your country.
I agree.
Next opening statement. Before we go on, we have Peter Bennett, from host of the Wall Street Hackers, opening statement on the tax cuts and Jobs Act of 2017.
Sure.
Just wealthy. What's your thoughts?
Thanks, Nick. I have to apologize. I was tied up with a business thing and I was trying to get on time. But so if I repeat anything that might have been said, I wasn't able to watch it, but I'll make it brief. Anytime you have a financial forecast, it could be a guess. It could be one of three things. It could be probable, it could be a guess, or it could be almost certain. In this case, I would say if the tax cuts are not extended, what I'm going to say is certain. So the history of tax cuts is very clear. Kennedy had a tax cut, Reagan had a tax cut, Trump had a tax cut. It not only boosted economic activity tremendously, it also increased revenues for the government. It was actually better for the tax collections. So that is a clear pattern. And I once looked at like 100 years of the tax rates and the streams, and it seemed to match that pretty well in terms of, a few years later, what was happening. But those are the very clear ones because there were 3 years. So if the Trump tax cuts are repealed in large part, even this is going to be the biggest tax increase in U.S. history. I'm pretty certain we're talking about a deep recession, definitely recession, likely very deep recession, possible almost depression or depression. I know that sounds scary or over predicting, but you can't suck that much money out of the economy and think it's going to keep proceeding. So that's my statement.
Oh, very good. Okay, rebuttal arguments. Rick Rosner, please. Oh, wait.
So neither
Yeah,
party
go ahead,
is concerned with the national debt. Though, as David will tell you, the last president who was Clinton 30 years ago. So what we have to look at is how do you mitigate the effects of not bringing in as much revenue as you're spending. And one way to mitigate it is to own the world. which is by increasing trade with the world and making the U.S. a great place to do business, which is everything Shaq was talking about.
Very good.
Australia just had the largest tax increase in OECD out of the OECD nations over the last since 2020. We've also seen an incredible cost of living increase, which I believe is higher than that of the United States. The economic situation here is very, very bad. People's cost of living has created a lack of money, obviously, for other things. So it's very clear to me that increasing taxes doesn't have that result. Now, if you want to capture more as a percentage of the GDP, that's fine. But really, as most economists will say, you have to broaden the tax base and you have to flatten out the tax rates. You can't just progressively increase it and just keep hitting the rich, because it just doesn't work.
Okay, David?
Yeah. Well, first, I like to focus on the future rather than the past. Let me just give a few summary comments. The act that we're talking about, the so-called Trump Tax Act, had positives and negatives. There's no way that it should be extended in whole. There are portions of it that undoubtedly will be extended. That'll be determined in large part based upon the result of the election in November, not just with regard to the president, but also with regard to the Senate and the House. I think it's important that we differentiate between corporate taxation and individual taxation. We must maintain competitiveness with regard to corporate taxation, because large global companies do not have duties of loyalty to countries. They have duties of loyalty to their shareholders. They can and will move and engage in a number of creative transactions in order to minimize their taxes to increase return to shareholders. That's just a fact. My personal view is we took rates down lower than we needed to in order to be competitive. We don't need to take them down further, if you will. Secondly, with regard to individual taxation, we need to understand that a vast majority of individuals in the United States pay more in payroll taxes than they do in income taxes. Payroll taxes are based upon the first dollar of wages and self-employment income. And as I said before, over 40% of individuals who file tax returns pay zero income tax. And about 20% of individuals who file individual income tax returns not only pay zero, they get money back through refundable tax credits. When I ended up doing the 10 million a minute tour in 2012 and engaging the American people on what type of reforms should we have in the tax system, here's some of the things that they said. They said that we need more people paying something on income taxes, and we need the wealthy to pay more on income taxes. They also said that the way to do it was through comprehensive tax reform that eliminated a lot of deductions, exemptions, credits, and exclusions. We spend $1.8 trillion a year, or forego revenues of $1.8 trillion a year, because of deductions, exemptions, and credits. And the better way to do it is to get rid of a lot of those and keep the tax rate as low as possible. For example, they supported the top tax rate of 28%, getting rid of a lot of deductions, exemptions, credits, and exclusions. I can come back and tell you some of the ones they felt we ought to keep. Okay. There are a few that they felt we ought to keep for a variety of reasons. But in addition to that, if you can keep the top individual income tax rate down to 28%, you can tax investment income the same as wages, because after all, you don't have to pay payroll taxes on investment income, and therefore there is an advantage to investments rather than wages and self-employment income. We have to keep in mind that a vast majority of small business, which is over 50% of jobs in this country, are not taxed based on C Corp. They're taxed as pass-through entities, so they're taxed based on individual income tax rates. And we also have to keep in mind, if we want to put our finances in order, while spending is our biggest problem, and we need to reduce spending as a percentage of GDP, we also need more revenues as a percentage of GDP. We are spending well above average as a percentage of GDP, and it's projected to go up. and we are taxing below average post World War II as a percentage of GDP. It's expected to go up a little bit if the Trump tax cuts expire, but not nearly as much as spending is going up, and so therefore the gap is growing. Bottom line, we need to quit trying to tinker with an overly complex and frankly, largely unenforceable tax code. And we need to get back and try to be able to make this thing simpler, fairer, more competitive, more enforceable. And that means get rid of a lot of tax preferences, keep rates as low as possible. That will be pro-growth. It'll also enable people to do a better job of determining what they owe, and the IRS a better job at being able to make sure people should pay what they should pay.
Responses?
I think that the TCJA actually should be called the Tax Cut Job Cuts law. I think David is right. We need to just seriously sit down and maybe reform the whole everything. I think that we can focus on reduced spending, but David, you'd always talked about reduce the bleed. And I think the bleed is the tax cuts that we've been doing. I think if we stop doing the tax cuts, that's not increasing taxes. That is different than increasing taxes. That's just saying we're not going to give you the tax cuts right now. Let's refill the pot of our revenue and then adjust the spending accordingly. I mean, when I'm at home, that's what I look at, right? When I look at my budgets, I do the same thing David says, stop the bleeding and then adjust accordingly. And I think we need to stop the bleed. And the biggest bleed is the tax cuts. They've even proved it. It did nothing to improve our revenue from foreign trade. In fact, it did worse. It went negative.
But Kim, as
if the tax cuts are to expire, it will most definitely be a massive tax increase.
Kim, as an individual, the first thing you do is you cut spending. You can't automatically increase revenue. Now, I agree with you that we need more revenues as a percentage of GDP. And I agree that the Trump tax bill should not be extended in whole. There are pieces of it I think should. But I think what we have to recognize is our whole system is fundamentally flawed. And it's time that we go back and try to modernize it, simplify it. And we can do that in a way that is pro-growth and that will generate more revenues as a percentage of GDP and will enable, us to be able to better enforce the law, because right now it's almost impossible. By the way, we wasted at least $1 trillion on the COVID aid that was given. And the first thing we ought to do is COVID's over. We're spending no more money on COVID. There's hundreds of billions of dollars that are still available for COVID subsidies. It's over.
Dave, I just want to bring up something that you mentioned before. You mentioned about making sure that corporations have a competitive tax rate, because obviously corporations are not beholden to a particular country. They can operate out of anywhere and they have international shareholders. And I would have said, hey, you also have to look after the entrepreneurial owners of some of these companies, because they're not going to come if they're going to be taxed too highly. I think that 28% tax rate that you talked about is probably about right. I'd probably go down to around 25%, I think. If you have a look at a place like Dubai, I'm not suggesting for a moment that the United States taxes itself the same way the Middle East does, but they were able to attract a lot of people because of there being a lack of paperwork, a lack of compliance things that they have to do. Now, the US has some natural advantages, and a 28% tax rate, I think, is reasonable. But I think they also, if the United States wants to attract people from all over the world to come over and start businesses, to take advantage of those investment visas, which are badly not meeting their quotas, you're not attracting as many people as you would like every year. I think you need to actually look at excluding some of the international money that's being earned, because a person, by virtue of becoming a green card holder in the United States, then has the added complexity of having to deal with all of their other earnings, which may not necessarily credit the taxes that they've paid elsewhere. So those
Tim,
sorts of
I just
complexities are
want to
totally
throw in
unnecessary.
that, my point about revenues, if you look at the history, and I have looked at the history, of the Kennedy, the Reagan, and the Trump tax cuts, the economies took off. And it's not like a household, because if you increase a household income or cuts, it doesn't necessarily affect things the same way. But with the government, if they see a tax cut that's eliminated is like a tax increase. So now we're talking about pulling money out of the economy. So it should very likely, I am certain, as a matter of fact, and I have not been wrong on a lot of my forecasts on Wall Street Hackers, and I've predicted a lot that other people didn't. But this one is like so obvious. You pull a lot of money out of the economy in any form directly, and that's going to slow economic activity. And the history shows that there's a very good chance that that would actually decrease revenues. So you've hurt the economy and you've hurt the government. So it doesn't really work the same, as you would expect necessarily. And anybody?
Well, Peter, have you ever come across a time when you look through your research? Was there ever a time that you saw, hey, this country increased its tax rates and they had a commensurate growth in their economy? It just doesn't happen. We don't see it anymore.
Great question. You know what? I never looked at other countries. I only looked at the revenue streams from like 1908 or whatever it was that I found. But the clearest cases, I mean, first of all, there was almost no break in that pattern. Taxes up, taxes down. But but there's a little lag effect. But the thing was, there were only three really, really significant ones that I know of and that I could find. Again, Kennedy cut taxes very dramatically. The economy did fabulously after that. Reagan cut taxes dramatically. The economy of the U.S. did tremendously after that. And Trump did the same. And the economy did extremely well after that in terms of growth in GDP for all of them and tax receipts again. So it's not a one-to-one thing, increase taxes and increase government revenues. It could be the exact opposite, increase taxes, and a tax cut that's eliminated is the exact same, basically.
There's that Laffer curve, and although it's not a fair comparison, you can also compare intrastate tax competition between the 50 states. So you can see, like in Massachusetts, where they've introduced a 4% wealth tax on people earning more than $1 million, plus they tax the value of all of your possessions. You've seen a mass exodus of millionaires out of Massachusetts. You see people moving to places like Florida and Texas and things like that. So you can see.
That's a good point in terms of economic activity that, it's a different kind of shift, but that's right. Why are people moving out of high tax states? Wealthy people. I know many who have moved from California, for instance, so that slows their economic activity and in a different form, but it's movement. And that's one of the problems, of course, with high corporate tax rates is you get companies moving, as David said, to other companies moving to other countries.
We see the entertainment industry leaving California because California's been slow to offer tax break for production. New Mexico building a ton of new studios because they offer tax. Breaking Bad wouldn't have taken place in Albuquerque except for the tax breaks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know my brother moved out of California to Seattle and I know other people have clients who are like that. I have a client who lives in Connecticut who is thinking of moving back, but the wife wants to move back to California, and the husband's saying, "No way, I'm not going to pay a 14% tax rate."
So in practical terms, you don't pay that because I've lived in California.
They make $1 million a year.
Okay, all right, maybe. But
in practical terms, they're different.
Yes, they do. They're the kind of client California might want.
Well, the other problem you have with a lot of these blue states, and as you know, Peter, I moved from Connecticut back to Virginia because I can read financial statements. You have a triple whammy in a lot of these blue states. One, they already have high taxes and excessive regulatory burdens. Secondly, they have huge unfunded pension and retiree health obligations, which means that taxes are only going to go one way over time if they don't reform that. And then thirdly, under the act that we're talking about here, they tend to have much higher property taxes. There's a cap on how much you can deduct, not just with regard to property taxes. There's a cap as to how much you can deduct with regard to state and local taxes, period. So that means property taxes, income taxes, etc. I lived for a period of time in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in the nice part of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and there is one. It's called Black Rock. It was beautiful. And I paid over $30,000 a year in property taxes for a home that was worth about $1 million, over 30,000 a year. Okay, and that doesn't end up counting state income taxes, okay, and sales taxes and everything else that you end up paying. So the blue states in many cases have a triple whammy, and this move within the United States between blue states and some of the red states is only going to accelerate over time based on the current path.
What I would be afraid of for the US, though, is that you're going to start to see people wanting to move internationally because,
Right.
hey, if the grass is greener somewhere else, go.
Like Nick.
I don't think anybody would move internationally.
But I've done that.
Oh,
I've done that from Australia. I've sat here in Australia and said I'm not giving you half of everything I earn.
Sorry.
New Zealand actually has a better tax system for me, even though it actually raises more as a percentage of the GDP. But obviously, I've gone to Europe because I'm British and I've got other options. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, David.
No, that's
Kinder.
You didn't.
David Kinder.
By the way, 9 million Americans, 9 million live offshore today. So I'm one of the 9 million. It's not like there's only a couple.
Well, look at migration. Look at the United Kingdom at the moment, right? So they've had 9,500 millionaires and billionaires, that sort of stuff, leave because of the ending of the non-domicile tax rate. Now, China has had 15,000. These guys have had 9,500. They've obviously got a much smaller population in the United Kingdom as what they do in China. That's absolutely atrocious. That's one of the largest rates in the world. It actually beats Russia for the amount of people that have left. It doesn't make sense. People don't want to have punitive confiscatory tax rates. They just don't. And yes, you can use techniques to reduce your taxes, but you can just up and leave if it's easy to do so. And if you've got a business where you can operate it from elsewhere, most people, I think, today, especially younger people, are going to look at those places where they're going to be treated better, where there's less complicated regulations, and they've got more freedom. They can sit by the beach with their laptop and their tablet and run their business.
So, for those who don't know about Spain, they have what they call a digital nomad visa with a top rate of 24%. So they cap you at 24, but you have to apply and get the visa. Then your rates are capped. I know everybody here likes to pay more than 24%, but some people don't.
Let me add a little bit because we talked about residential real estate and such. Now, here's the thing: the cap on home mortgage interest rate deductions is now limited to $750,000 of home acquisition costs. It used to be $1 million. So Trump actually lowered that. Now let's combine that with state economics, because Newsom, in his infinite wisdom, decided to end single-family zoning. Now, what does that do? That increases the pricing of existing homes, which is going to make it harder to at least have the majority of your interest be able to be deducted from your taxes. What does that do? Individual homeowners are not going to want to buy necessarily if they're driven by the tax code, but it makes it a great place for companies like BlackRock to continue buying these single-family homes, turn them into Airbnbs, and make their money that way because they can deduct it as a business expense as opposed to doing it on an individual level. One last thing I wanted to add is that charitable deductions, Americans are giving people. And I don't think that charitable deductions has taken a reduction, but most of the time they can't deduct it if they're deducting up to their standard deduction. So those things probably might have a small ripple effect, but I think the American people are more giving than that. They're going to continue giving to their very charitable causes. But at the same time, they're going to see then their tax return, as my parents saw, they couldn't take any additional tax benefit because it went right up to their standard deduction.
You guys,
the comment you just made about BlackRock also applies to foreign investors investing in property in the United States. I sat down with a friend of mine who owns around $10 million worth of properties in California, and I was going through everything, and it would actually turn out that if I had exactly the same properties as he had, I would actually end up with more money than he did because of the fact that obviously I'm not having to pay your taxes and all the deductions I get in the tax jurisdiction I'm located in. So the United States, by having an inefficient tax code, leaves itself in a position where Americans are worse off and foreign investors who are not contributing anything are better off. Now, that's great for me, but I love your country, so I think you should get your act together.
Yeah, can I jump in for a second, Nick? The three primary tax preferences that individuals supported to retain in a dramatically reformed tax system that lowers the top tax rate to 28% were as follows. Number one, deduction for a primary residence for amount of the loan up to the maximum conforming loan, which varies by region of country. No deduction for interest on any other home. So just primary home up to the maximum conforming loan, which varies by region of the country. Secondly, reduction for retirement savings, because people should not be relying solely on Social Security, for their retirement income. And thirdly, charitable contributions. Over time, government's going to do less. Therefore, charitable organizations will need to do more, and individuals will need to do more for themselves. So those were the three big examples of things that people felt we needed to keep. And there were three on the corporate side too, which I won't go into right now because other people have their hands up. Go ahead.
All right, people like to complain about California taxes, but we have Proposition 13, which is a crazy property tax law that is freaking great. It was designed to make it possible it's 48 years old or so, that law, designed to make it possible for old people to not be driven out of their homes by property taxes. So it limits the amount that your property taxes can go up. So if you can buy a home in California and stay in it for a decade or two, your property taxes go to just ridiculously small. David says he was paying 3% per annum in property taxes. We've owned our home for more than 20 years. We pay 1/3 of 1% in property taxes.
Ooh. Some in California actually did good. I did not know that, Rick. Because
they wanted to drive up the price of property in California.
Right.
Shakil's
right.
That's why California has all these onerous. That's why California has all these onerous regulations in relation to property, because they don't want to release the regulations like they have in Texas, because it means that property prices go up and everybody else is priced out of the market. And then you can use your property to borrow money to go to invest it elsewhere. It's a tax-free situation, right?
Here's what you do. You wait for the next big earthquake and you buy one or more houses that have been red tagged, that have had the crap beaten out of them, and you slowly rehab them. That's what, when we had the big earthquake in 2004, back when there were still big porno companies, that's what they did. They bought hundreds of houses with their dirty money. You couldn't live in the houses, but you could shoot dirty movies in those houses, and they slowly rehabbed them and tossed them back out on the market.
Well, Rick,
we just saying on the news that there's some North Carolina houses on stilts on the beach that have been swept away, but a couple of them are still there. I'm not sure why people in North Carolina would want to build a house on soft sand at a beach, but that's what's been shown in our news. So maybe there's some cheap buying there.
Well, the flooding is actually in the more mountainous part in western North Carolina.
I'll send you a link to the Sky News Australia news footage of this particular thing. There's these two houses, they're on stilts on the beach, and I'm like,
there's like three houses that.
Oh no, you're right. No, you're right.
There are three houses that have fallen in the beach there in Cape Hatteras, or four and something like that. But to your point, Dave, I know
just so you know what news we got over here.
There is some serious flooding in where our farmers market is, because my dad's lady friend sent me a picture, because she doesn't live that far from there, but it was looked like a mini lake or a mini river because of the flooding, and that's in central North Carolina, because that's in the research.
And western North Carolina is in bad shape too.
It is, and we're in good shape.
Yeah, we're suffering here ever since Nick left for Spain, but we have to go now. So everyone be safe.
The weather's great in Barcelona, and we're out of time, so we don't thank the Honorable David M. Walker, former Comptroller General of the United States, and our elite panelists to discuss the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, and we'll see you next week on another show. Take care. Bye.